I want to thank our two speakers for giving really two excellent and very complimentary presentations focusing on very different issues. If I may, I'd like to just make two very brief comments. One, again, if I may, has to do with the economy. You mentioned it as one of your five characteristics that make Turkey unique. But I wonder to what extent, if you will, not realpolitik, but real economy, has played a role in Turkish foreign policy in the region, given the very strong thrust of entrepreneurial activities and the rise of the bourgeoisie and the clear need for markets in the region, particularly vis-à-vis Iraq, for example, but other countries in the region as well. That was implicit in your comments, but again, if you would be willing to comment very briefly so we could get to the questions. The other, I think, has to do with, again, this notion of Turkey being a model for the region, a democratic model. The model has been, by and large, a passive one, I think, as you have mentioned. So quite aside from the way that you presented the question, that here you are, a superpower in the region, now do something, right? Well, but aside from that, here you are a democratic, Islamic, democratic, let's say, government, then throw your support behind democratic movements. I think, as both of you indicated, Turkey has been somewhat reluctant in this manner. Let me mention another example of that reluctance. I remember when Ahmadinejad was elected, Turkey was the second, if not the first country to congratulate him, which was absolutely astounding given the fact what was going on the streets of Tehran and the full awareness on the part of the Turkish government about the very contentious nature of that election. One might have thought that the great bastion of Islamic democracy in the region would be at least more measured in this manner. What could explain that kind of enthusiasm for Ahmadinejad at the time that it occurred?
So, can I just try to answer your points very quickly? Your 2 points are interconnected. The economy explains to a certain degree why Turkey wants stability in the region. Turkey is a status quo-oriented country. It doesn't want really regime changes or revolutionary changes in the region, essentially because of its fear of the Kurdish problem. When you talk about self-determination in the Middle East, people's movements, there is this fear that down the line this may impact the Kurdish question as well. But it is also a country that is a very strong economy, and for the strong economy to function well, you need to have markets. Some people call Turkey the merchant state, mercantilism, as the main driver of Turkish foreign policy. There is an element of truth to that. Why do you think Turkey was so reluctant to get involved in Libya, or to get NATO involved in Libya? Because there were commercial interests in Libya with the Gaddafi government. Turkey had basically construction companies that were owed something along the lines of $15 billion. And if Gaddafi is gone, if you basically wage war in Libya, if you destabilize Libya, what would happen to this money that is owed to Turkish companies? So there's a certain status quo-oriented, stability-oriented approach that comes with being dependent on the status quo stability in the region. It is absolutely shameful that Abdullah Gül was the second or first president to call Ahmadinejad after the elections in Iran. And Turkey's insensitivity to the Green Movement was also shameful. Because what was the difference between the Green Movement in the streets of Tehran and the Tahrir Square? Not much. But Turkey basically ignored the Green Movement and congratulated Ahmadinejad. But with the Tahrir Square, it went basically for full support. Well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that Turkey does not want to rock the boat with the government of Iran, because it is dependent on Iran on a number of issues. 85% of Turkish economy depends on gas, natural gas and oil coming from two countries, Russia and Iran. So if you rock the boat with Iran, that may have an impact on your economy. There is a lot of trade with Iran. But more importantly, Iran also holds the Kurdish card. Iran can also destabilize Turkey by using the PKK card. So there are all these factors that actually creates tension between Turkey's hope of seeing democracy in the region, this whole business about Turkey as a model, etc., and actually Turkey's invested interest in stability as a merchant country, as a capitalist country for these markets. This creates a tension in Turkey between realpolitik and the ideals of democratization.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would just echo a few things, but highlight them in perhaps a little bit different way. I think the other point here is, it's exactly what Omer and I both are referencing. When you set out principles that are supposed to be universalistic, then when suddenly the reality is, there's a conflict there, then you have to make a choice. And it doesn't make any sense to criticize Israel so harshly for its policies on being oppressive and apartheid state, making nasty comments about free speech in France, and yet people point to your own country and say, wait a minute, what about you guys? You have the most number of journalists in jail. You called Ahmadinejad first. And I would echo, kind of Omer's point here. I wouldn't put as much. I definitely think that the economy is a factor on the Iran one, but I think the geopolitical game with Iran is a much bigger factor. Turkey desperately wants to be the solution. They want to be the bridge between Iran and America. Of course, the Iranians nor the Americans really want to solve their issues through Turkey. I mean, I think Americans are more willing to use Turkey than the Iranians. But the Iranians, at the end of the day, have a regime that has been in place that basically has built its own legitimacy on anti-American rhetoric. So Turkey being this kind of soft model, I think that Turkey's been very disappointed. And in the last year, the rhetoric out of Tehran against Ankara has been unbelievable. At the moment that Turkey began to kind of build these radar sites and decided to go more in line with the transatlantic community over the last year because of the Arab Spring, in many ways there's a proxy war going on in the region now. The Sunni-Shia divide that Omer is talking about is not just between the Saudi Arabians that despise the Turks and the Turks who reciprocate, but it's also with the Iranians who are like in many ways fighting for the last bastion in Syria. Because as Hezbollah and other groups have begun to try to figure out new ways of dealing with the crisis that's going on in Syria that's prevented the arms to go through, Turkey is trying to find a way of saying, look, we don't want to get into direct conflict. There is a need in some ways to be loved in Turkey, wanting to please everybody at once. And like Omer rightly said, if you're going to be on the side of Iran or Syria in terms of Assad and Ahmadinejad or Khomeini regime, there's a major problem here. And I think that one of the points that you pointed at, if I can just do a small advertisement, I think my co-author Nader Habibi is here, who's an economist, and we looked at this idea of kind of Turkey's role in the Middle East. And you're absolutely right. The real economy is directly what the Turkish version of realpolitik. And the difference here is when you look at the absolute value of how the Turkish trade in the Middle East has been going, it's been on an upward trajectory. It's not as significant, right? It's not 50% like the EU is and was, but it's growing at an exponentially faster rate. And so the real question now is, this Arab Spring has messed that up. Right? The Arab Spring has suddenly thrown the entire region into instability, and the Turks are basically trying to figure out a way to secure their business interests in certain areas of the world, and particularly in the Middle East, while at the same time retaining the flow of information. And in many ways, they're kind of saying, look, the Iranians are causing major trouble here. Stop the rhetoric on Israel. Stop the rhetoric about a war between these two countries. And Turkey is caught in the middle because any instability will hurt the Turkish economy more than anybody else. And it's already, the European market has already become very unstable for Turkey. The last thing they really want is for the entire neighborhood, in terms of the Gulf states and in terms of the war between Israel and Iran, what that would mean. So you're absolutely right.
Excellent. Okay. Would you kindly introduce yourself? Say your names and then ask your questions, if possible, briefly. Thank you. Yes.
Iran and Turkey are rivals, so they do a dance of threat and congratulations, and so that things don't get worse. But that's not my question. One of the speakers was saying that Turkish economy was very good because exports was very high, but on the other hand, what happens if you import more than export? Does this affect the GDP positively or negatively?
Very short, we have a current account deficit problem, which is slowing down because Turkish economy is actually slowing down. But overall, the point that I was trying to make is that Turkey, compared to the Middle East, is an export-led economy and manufacturing sector and taxation-based.
No, in America or in Turkey, the net export counts. it's both negative affects GDP. Now, I have not been in Turkey for a long time, but what is carrying Turkish economy is consumerism. Consumerism is 71% of American economy. So maybe, probably, from what I read, I don't know, that there is no savings. Well, borrowings that go 50% every year. So internal consumerism is causing an explosion in GDP.
Keep that as a comment.
As you said, having more imports is very dangerous because you have to pay this, the difference. If you don't have dollars, who's going to pay this? Anyway.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you for your very insightful presentation.
Your name?
My name is Pelin Gökçe. And you mentioned in your talk, I think this question is to both of you, the sort of authoritarian style of the Prime Minister, the jailing of journalists. And I was wondering what your take is on the ongoing military trials, both the Ergenekon and the Bayros trials, as well as the jailing of high number of journalists, although two, I think, before most of them let out. And to what extent you think this is a healthy process of democratization for Turkey, or whether it's the regime's way of showing some strength and silencing opposition?
I'll jump in real quick because this is absolutely something that's mind-blowing. The foreign minister was just in Washington 3 weeks ago, and he got a few questions on this. And if you read the New Yorker article a couple of days ago with Erdogan, that's basically what you're referencing, their response is very similar. They're kind of like, hey guys, look what else we've done in this region. Like, why are you bothering us? Journalists are not a big deal. These guys aren't really journalists, they're terrorists, right? These guys are not real journalists. And certainly, journalism, and I know Omer is a columnist for one of the Turkish newspapers, so I think he would probably agree. Journalism in Turkey does not have the right standards, absolutely. But that type of argument doesn't pass muster in the West, right? The bottom line is, okay, why is it that people are beginning to self-censor themselves? Why is it that it is clear that there's fabrication in the trials that are going on? I mean, I think I was one of the first people to write in the English language about Ergenekon and these trials, and I basically said, look, this is a good thing. I think it's a good thing for the deep state to be called to account and to be put on trial. But yet the problem is it's become a score-settling mechanism. And I think Omer said it well, and I want to hear him expand on it as well, that the split between the AKP and the Gülen movement can be seen very clearly. Right? Like, I'll point it out directly. Zaman newspaper has been more in touch with Ergenekon and the sledgehammer in these cases in many ways than it's been on almost any other topic. Right? Even at the time in which people were kind of scratching their heads saying, why are only these guys focusing on it? To me, this is not a question of just about the AKP. This is about the internal schism of the broad tint of AKP leadership. Because many people I talk to within the government are very uncomfortable about this, because they understand that this is something that the West values very strongly. It's very easy for Western journalists to point to their own and say, I knew this person, they're in jail, he's not a terrorist, he may be a nationalist, he may be anti-Erdogan, he may be anti-Gülen movement, but he doesn't deserve to be in jail. And I think that this type of rhetoric that the government is using, instead of explaining very clearly the problems that they have in their own coalition because they're trying to keep their own house in order, this is where it's going to become problematic. And this is why I fear that that kind of hegemonic structure that's been put in place is precisely what Omer referenced, right? He basically said you went from a Kemalist authoritarianism into something else. And what concerns me as well is the perception, which is, I agree, 100% reality. If the Prime Minister goes to become President and the President goes to become Prime Minister, we have a term for that. It's called Russia, right? And Turkey does not deserve to be like a Russia. The people of the country, the civil society of the country, the Gülen movement, everybody deserves better than that. And so being able to find a way in which the Constitution has to be the priority here, because if you have the right Constitution in place and you have the right rule of law that was a true independent judiciary and a true independent police force, etc., then you don't have some of these problems. And so these are all growing pains. And I certainly don't want to be the pessimist who says these are major problems, but you need to focus on that and not simply brush aside that and use this rhetoric of, well, it's always the West. When the Economist article criticizes us, when the Financial Times criticizes, when the New York Times criticizes us, they use it in a populistic way and say, of course they're going to criticize us because they're scared of Turkish power and we are the Turkish people and we will rise against this type of anti-Western imperialism.
Briefly, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, the good news again is that the days of the military coup are over in Turkey. The military tutelage system has basically come to an end. However, the price to pay for this has been the jailing of I don't know, 15-20% of active duty generals, the jailing of the former chief of staff. And there has been a silent revolution in Turkey in terms of civil-military relations. And that's a good thing. Turkey is becoming, in my opinion, as far as civil-military relations are concerned, a more democratic country. But the problem of liberal democracy is beyond that. The problem of liberal democracy is about freedoms, minority rights, about freedom of association, freedom of speech. And you have major issues on these areas, not because of the problem related to political Islam, secularism, civil-military relations, but now, for instance, AKP is in charge, but the Kurdish problem is arguably at a point where there is more polarization in the country. We're nowhere close to solving the Kurdish problem through enlarging freedoms. To the contrary, because of the arrests of journalists, Kurdish journalists, who are perceived as Kurdish militants because they have links to certain Kurdish organizations that are actually advocating, for instance, an agenda that is perceived as a terrorist agenda. We are unable in the Turkish constitution, in the Turkish system, to distinguish between what is freedom of speech and what is a violent movement that is determined to basically end the state or destroy the state. Everything that is critical of the unitary nature of the state becomes into a kind of terrorist, is emboldened, is perceived as a kind of potentially terrorist movement. So here we need, of course, constitutional change. And the AKP has been reluctant to go after that because it's not really perceived as a vote winner for the AKP. The Prime Minister has put on the brakes on this constitutional debate, and there's essentially no movement in terms of tackling issues that would transform Turkey from being a majoritarian democracy into a liberal democracy. And I already mentioned the issues regarding the Gülen movement and AKP in this question, but I think the Gülen movement feels very insecure vis-à-vis the military because they don't think that the days of a military coup are over. They still think that there is a potential return of the deep state. They feel very insecure because, partly because of the mistakes that the military did. In the eyes of the military, the AKP was an Islamist movement, but they were out in the open. They were dealing with them. Whereas the Gülen movement was the real irtija, as they called it. The real irtija was the Gülen movement. They really wanted to go after the Gülen movement. And the Gülen movement, through its basically networks within the state, learned that. And they realized that this is an existential debate for them. If they don't go after the people who are about to destroy them, they will be destroyed. So this turned into a zero-sum game for the Gülen movement, whereas the AKP in power managed to cut deals or establish a modus vivendi with the military or the deep state to a certain degree, which the Gülen movement did not want to go, did not want to have. So now you have basically this threat perception of the Gülen movement that is different than the threat perception of AKP. And here we have a major fissure, we have a major crack in this so-called conservative pious coalition between the AKP and the Gülen movement. I don't know to what degree this will continue. I think the crisis over the intelligence agency MIT in Turkey is more or less solved, but we have definitely come to a new paradigm. We have reached a new paradigm in terms of civil-military relations and in terms of relations between the AKP and the Gülen community.
Yes.
You were just talking about them. I'm not totally clearly understanding how the Gülen movement was so engaged with the military in the state when the military was more oppressive, like really hostile against Islamists. And at that time, the leader, Fethullah Gülen, was voting pro-military. I interviewed him. He said, the best time in my life was my military service. And there is a sense in the movement that they actually live for the state of the nation. And they appreciate their military power. And these things happen when the military was most repressive. So nowadays, the military's power in politics is being reduced because of the reforms, etc. And you're arguing now they're more threatened by the military. So that is a paradox to me. And in terms of the insecurity of the Gülen movement, this movement has been engaging to every host state that has been been working in. I mean, they're all over the globe, very friendly with states, very cooperative even with Washington. Why would they be insecure? I mean, in terms of economics, too, this is an economic empire. They have so much money. So I really have a big question about their insecurity and why they would turn insecure when they're so much more powerful now.
The short answer is that the threat perception does not go away. There is a narrative of victimhood, and there is a perception of threat that is still there. But your point about AKP being pro-military, I think the issue during the 28 February process, for instance, the issue here is that the Gülen movement being pro-military, the Gülen movement always had a problem with Milli Görüş. Milli Görüş was political Islam, so to speak, and it had basically echoes of the Muslim Brotherhood. Whereas the Gülen movement was Anatolian Islam. It had no problem, essentially, with the role of the state, Kemalism, Atatürk. It had this narrative of victimhood, but it did not want to challenge the secularist system. It believed in a social, cultural process of winning hearts and minds, whereas the AKP was the political instrument, Milli Görüş was the political movement, and Fethullah Gülen himself was always in distance to Erbakan. So we should not interpret basically the distance between Milli Görüş and the Gülen movement as basically the Gülen movement being very pro-military. They had problems, but they basically had a different strategy to deal with the radical secularism of Turkey. It was through culture, social methods to education, whereas Milli Görüş was going for the political route. I think the military in 2007 realized that they can deal to a certain degree with AKP. But they have rightly come to understand that in their system of radical secularism, the Gülen movement is the most important threat. So their threat perception of officers, of the generals, etc., became the Gülen movement. They started naming Jamaat as the problem. And I think they wanted AKP to distance itself from the Jamaat. And the opposite happened, because the Prime Minister, to his credit, decided to call for elections and did not really pursue a strategy of going after the Gülen movement. This is why after 2007 we had this unbelievable unity between the Gülen movement and AKP, unprecedented level of unity, because the Gülen movement up until then was still trying to maintain a certain level of distance to politics. But once they felt that they were threatened to such degree by the military, they started to go after it. Now that you have the generals in jail, that now that the days of the military coup are over, you may expect that they would basically say, okay, mission accomplished, it's fine. And AKP wants them to say, mission accomplished, let's put on the brakes, let's basically say it. But they believe that the reason why the days of the military coup are over is because they have been going after the military. And they want the AKP to be fully supportive of that. But there is also the Kurdish question, on which they differ with the AKP to a certain degree. Because I think the Gülen movement, compared to the AKP, is more nationalist. The AKP is willing to consider a narrative of, we're all Muslim, why can't we get along? A more universal Islam approach to the Kurdish problem. Whereas I think in the eyes of the Gülen movement, there is still this attachment to the idea of Turkish Islam, Turkishness, and an attempt to basically solve the Kurdish problem through social economic development, not to address the identity dimension. That's why now currently you have this big division in Turkey between the liberal Democrats, who used to be very close to the Gülen movement, who now are distancing themselves from the Gülen movement because of the Gülen movement's position on the Kurdish question. And the Kurdish question is creating a divide between liberal Democrats and the Gülen movement. Again, those are issues that are very difficult to grasp for a foreign audience, but I think they're at the heart of the power struggle in Turkey.
Thank you. Yes, in the back. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent talks. Joshua, I will listen to your talk recording in slow motion once more. It was very nice, thank you. I have two questions, which are both shortened, but mainly to Omer Taspinar. So, do you really believe that the days of coup are over without a new constitution? Let's say Erdogan is not here. Do you think it's really over without Erdogan? in place. And the second thing is the Sufi movements becoming political. I mean that those claims were always there for over 30 years. Islam is trying to infiltrate, take over, especially the Gulen movement. And those claims were quieter in the past years, but in the past couple of weeks, with the addition of WikiLeaks, Taraf's newspapers, articles, we started hearing it again. What changed?
I think the fact that you're asking the question of are the days of military coup over, do I really believe is that to a certain degree you think that they're not. And I think that that's exactly the point. The Gulen movement doesn't think that the days of the military coups are over. What I think about it is that it's not just to Erdogan that the military has been undermined. Turkey is structurally changing. The fact that you have a middle class in Turkey now, you have the fact that you have a civil society movement, you have a majority of people who basically don't want the military to intervene is a very important change. It's not really thanks to Erdogan, it's thanks to the last, I would say, 20 years of development in Turkey, the emergence of a society that respects the military but doesn't want it to be involved. As long as things will go fine in Turkey, economy will go fine, as long as basically there will be an absence of chaos, anarchy, people won't want a military intervention. And in that sense, I think that Turkey has passed a certain threshold in terms of income per capita, in terms of emerging of a middle class, in terms of establishing, although at a rudimentary level, certain checks and balances. It would be very difficult in Turkey, even if there was basically instability, to put tanks in the street and to have the military involved once again in running the country. Now, there can be different coups. There can be a postmodern coup, there can be, again, memorandums issued. That's another story. But I understand your question, and I link it to my analysis of saying that a lot of people, especially within the Gulen movement, think that the reason why we have reached this plateau now of basically days of a military coup are over, if we believe so, it's because of all the things that have been done, including the Ergenekon trial. If you get these guys out of jail, if you basically allow that to allow things to turn to business as usual, we may return to the old dark days where we suffered, where basically pious conservatives were thrown out of universities, where we couldn't go to the universities with our headscarves. That's the narrative of victimhood kicking in. In other words, the narrative of victimhood is so powerful, the threat perception is so powerful, that we are unable to create a normal society where threat perceptions are minimized and we basically are able to function without this zero-sum game world. I forgot the next part of your question. You had this.
It's okay. No, it's okay. One last question, please. Yes.
Well, Ayşe Coşkun is my name. And during the talk, you mentioned more than one time the narrative of victimhood. Yeah. And in last sentence, you give examples like not being able to go to universities, or being kicked out from universities. But as far as I can tell, I mean, throughout the Gulen sermons, that's true. I mean, victimhood is very strong, but I can't recall him once Gulen mentioning this type of issues. I mean, I think the victimhood he's talking about is different. I mean, the gariplik concept. I mean, the concept of like being garip or victim. Maybe I'm missing, so if you could elaborate a little.
No, you're right, and I'm familiar with what Hoca Efendi said on this issue. He said, I think that we should not forget the larger issues here, and that the headscarf should not be the driving factor. But that doesn't mean that there was no sense of empathy and a narrative related to this issue. So there were many other issues related to the narrative of victimhood, not just the headscarf. The fact that you would be discriminated against if your wife is wearing the headscarf. You would be discriminated against if you're a pious Muslim paying 5 times a day. I mean, those were the dark days of basically they felt that they were basically living in an apartheid society. Why do you think this black Turks, white Turks terminology emerged in terms of who really owns the country? It was the secularists. But the danger today is that you have the so-called white Turks themselves developing a similar narrative of victimhood, because they feel that they being challenged, they're being discriminated against. They believe that what has rightly started as a legitimate campaign to go after the coup plotters, Ergenekon, has turned into a witch hunt against all the opponents of the regime. And interestingly here, it's the AKP that wants to put the brakes on because they're suffering from this image of Turkey. And they have been the ones who have released Nedim Şener and Ahmet Şık. And I think it's very much related to the problem that had happened because of the intelligence issue, MIT issue. And here we see basically AKP trying to say, look, we have reached a level of civil-military relations where we can afford some relaxation now. But I think because the Gülen movement felt much more threatened than the AKP itself from the military, there is this belief that we should still be very cautious. We should not relax because these dark days may come back. And that's the kind of paradox that Berna was asking. I mean, normally you would expect the movement to say, okay, we're fine now, the military is in jail, etc., but things change and they may get out and they may come back with a vengeance. That's the fear. That's the fear of basically them coming back one day, taking revenge. I hate to end on a gloomy note.
Well, contrary to that final note, I think this has been a terrifically uplifting and informative and enlightening conference. I would like to ask all of you to join me in thanking our speakers, as well as all other speakers of today, and many individuals who worked very hard to make this possible.